Welcome back to another episode. Thank you for tuning in to Flipping the Barrel. Today, we will be interviewing Anne Fox, a woman who leads by example. She's a captain for the U.S. Marines and the CEO of an emerging growth company and one of the few survivors from the 2015 and 2016 downturn, ENERY service. She is an inspiration to not only women, but men as well. She is one of the most loved CEOs in the energy business. She puts her employees first and always has an open door policy.
And thank you so much for being on here today.
Oh, thank you both for having me.
You are the first woman CEO to be on the podcast, and we're really, really excited. And I honestly can't believe that one of the top 25 most influential women in energy is sitting right across from me.
Well, this should be fun.
Yeah. So let's start. Tell us how it was like growing up as Anne Fox. Details. What was your childhood like?
Oh boy, hard to capture that in a couple of minutes. So I grew up in a very rural area northwest of Boston, Massachusetts, and it was, a lot of dirt roads. My original house that I was in was the one I stayed in for the majority of my childhood and young adulthood. My parents started out by buying the land, and they bought a prefabbed house that came on a trailer. Oh, wow. And they put it up together. And as I grew up, it got different pieces and parts added onto it as they would get a little bit more cash in their pocket. But it was miles and miles of cornfields and open fields and streams and very idyllic little country lifestyle. And my grandpa was a dairy farmer. So he also raised standard bred horses. So we had buggies and carriages, and oftentimes we would go in the sleighs in the winter. So a really sheltered childhood, but a fun one. And it was marked by a ton of time outdoors. So on a Saturday, it might be soccer, and then it was kickball in the yard. There weren't any kids that lived around with the exception of two boys that were about a mile from us. So I kind of inherited two more brothers, plus my own brother.
Nice.
And sometimes they excluded me and sometimes they included me. So a lot of times we would play Army. And at that time, our fake enemies were always the Russians.
The Russians.
And we would play out in the woods and build bridges and things like that. And it's kind of ironic because one of those boys actually ended up being the general counsel for RSP Permian, which was purchased by Concho. So we always laugh like we both somehow ended up down here.
Wow.
But yeah, so it was a very simple lifestyle. I grew up very much kind of middle class. I never felt poor. I wasn't poor, but I was also not privileged as a child. Both my parents were extremely engaged in raising us. I also came from a family where my parents had an exceptional marriage. And so it was a pretty steady Eddie, consistent life. And I went horseback riding constantly out in the trails by my house. My mom was a big horseback rider, so we were always out there. And then the boys were always on their ATVs.
Yeah.
So it was very just rugged, rural country, very, very different than how my children are growing up, definitely.
Wow.
Yeah. So what did your parents do for a living?
So my mom stayed home and raised us until I was about 12 years old. She was a real estate agent in the area. And then she got into the hotel business when, once I was a little bit older. But definitely spent the majority of my childhood, making the snack in the afternoon and, picking us up from school and doing the homework. Yeah. And my dad was kind of an entrepreneur, did a bunch of different things in the manufacturing side to include worked with glass bottling manufacturers. At one point worked making pieces and parts for Sikorsky helicopters. So a ton of different things. But it was, again, a very steady lifestyle and a very simple one. And I loved it, and I reflect on it often as being very lucky because it was such a happy and joyous time for me.
Yeah, it's definitely different, I think, for everybody growing up with, being able to have that opportunity to be outside and outdoors and have the steady family. Like, how'd that impact you when you got into college or high school when things probably weren't probably as, I guess, sheltered or as easy as maybe it seemed back at home, because everything seemed so steady, basically, right? Because your parents and where you lived and all of that.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I think everybody analyzes their own personal experience to try and inform how they interpret things going on around them in their adult, life. So whether that's right or wrong, I do it too. And I often think that my childhood was so sound and so secure that it enabled me to handle what would become much more high pressure situations and chaotic situations that I would face later in my life, certainly in combat and in the Marine Corps. So I've thought of that often, and I think it also made me a very confident person. Humility was a big thing in our family. Mm-hmm. So arrogance was never accepted, but we were definitely confident, and we didn't have anyone around, again, except for the two boys up the street. So there was never a proving ground either. Mm-hmm. I was never part of a neighborhood with a ton of kids where we were trying to one up each other. So I did never really experience that. And that probably had an impact on me as well. And as I said, I was often excluded by the boys. So it forced a lot of independence, and that meant they might just ditch me in the woods at any given point in time. Mm-hmm. So I think I got used to spending quite a bit of time on my own also, which helped me out later in life too, because at the end of the day, leadership is a very lonely place to be.
Yeah. And growing up, did you want to leave this small town? Was it a small town? I'm assuming?
Yeah, it was a small town. I never had that yearning. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I ended up going to a very, what would be considered elite high school. And I remember the first day driving on that campus, and none of my parents or family had ever been to something like that, and I could tell my parents thought that would be, a huge step mm-hmm. up, and I also don't think they thought I could get in. So I remember thinking, wow, this is it was a very eye-opening experience for me driving on that campus, and I remember really wanting to go. So I think that probably did broaden my horizons. So I don't ever remember wanting to leave Westford, which was actually the town that I grew up in, just because it was always a fond and very warm place for me. So I never did feel like I needed to leave it. My husband and I always joke because he grew up in a really rural situation, but it was more of a broken town and some of kind of the darker sides of rural America. So we always say I grew up in Little House on the Prairie.
Yeah, that's what it sounds. That's what I picture in my head when you're telling your story.
Yeah. So again, very fortunate. But yeah, never longed to leave it. And then of course I went to this high school, which was just a mind-blowing experience for me, and I ended up boarding there the last few years of my time there. So,
what do you mean by boarding? Like it was a boarding school?
It was a boarding school.
Okay.
I lived close enough to be a day student in the beginning, and then the schedule was so intense that I actually couldn't afford to do the commute. So it was a very, very structured. You started chapel every morning, and classes were 6 days a week. Very rigorous academics and also very rigorous sports. So, and very formal dinners. So they purposely gave you no time. And you had to manage a lot within that time frame. So
what made you want to go to that school?
I just was drawn to intense environments like that, whether it was that particular school called the Groton School or the Marine Corps. I still can't figure out exactly why. Maybe again, because I had such a sound, stable childhood, but I liked the challenge. I really liked the challenge of performing.
And did your parents push academics on you from a young age, or do you think your mom wanted you to maybe stay back and maybe do what she did and raise your kids? And
No, never. So I should mention that my parents often encouraged me never to have children. Oh, wow. My dad often made comments that I was not a breeding cow.
Really?
And
wow.
that I didn't ever need to get married. So it was interesting because, again, my parents had this really incredible relationship. Yeah. But in a quiet way, my dad was definitely, clearly, as I reflect back, a very big supporter of women's rights. And I think, I now can see where that influenced my life. But I was never I never had Barbie dolls or Cabbage Patch Kids. And I remember when preemies came out when I was little, I distinctly remember this because, of course, we didn't have the internet and the advertising. And I can remember wanting one so badly. And those were the Cabbage Patch Kids that were actually in the form of infants, like true little ones. And my parents just absolutely refused to get me one. So it was always, kicked out with the boys, always wore their hand-me-downs. So I got, the two boys that I keep mentioning, Jim and Chris, I would get, they would wear their cords and then pass them down and then pass them to my brother and then I would get them. So, so there was also no fun clothing for me when I was little. So it was definitely a not a gender specific. I mean, there was nothing pink in my house, which, today, if you went to my daughter's room, it's like all pink.
Yeah.
And I love pink actually. But, so yeah, it's kind of funny when I think about that. And, I think my parents never pushed me because I pushed myself. I mean, I can remember my mom telling me to stop doing homework and, telling me to stop focusing on things and kind of getting stressed out about performing on tests. So I feel like my mom especially was always dialing me back. She was actually a public school third grade teacher for 10 years prior to having children. Because again, in that day and age, when you got pregnant, you really were almost excused from work. And people didn't want people who were, showing their pregnancy working. So obviously a very different time, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So she had an educational background. Education was always very, very important to my parents. And I remember at the time that they sent me to Groton, it was very expensive. And it was an absolute financial priority for them at that time. And I remember thinking that our whole house could burn down around us and they would still find a way to send me to that school. So that there was definitely that focus, but I never felt like my parents were kicking me. I actually felt like they were always wishing I would calm down a little bit, which I did. I did over time. I did calm down. Yeah. But yeah. So that was really more how it was set up between us. So
what was it like after high school, after you left the Groton?
Yes, Groton. Yeah. So I ended up going to Georgetown, and there were two schools I was just dying to go to. One was Georgetown's Foreign Service School, but the real school I wanted to go to, which I got rejected from, was Princeton University has a school called the Woodrow Wilson School.
Okay.
And I was very interested in the Foreign Service. I really thought I wanted to go into the State Department. And the Woodrow Wilson School is kind of one of the premier best schools. And that was what I had my heart set on. And again, I was firmly rejected. And ended up at Georgetown, which was a wonderful experience for me because, of course, it's smack in the middle of Washington, D.C., and I ended up majoring in international security and diplomacy in world affairs. So it was a wonderful experience for me. And of course, I thought then I would go into the State Department, and then I think learned that I would be buried in a basement somewhere doing nothing at the State Department.
Yeah, you're like, I don't think I want to do that anymore.
Right. So actually, in my junior year of school, I tried to join the Marine Corps. And I remember going down to Richmond and filling out all the paperwork and thinking that my parents would be, so proud of me. And they weren't. I thought that was one of the more silly ideas I had ever had, and that it would be a complete waste. And my father in particular was extremely against the idea because he had a strong disdain for the Marines. He was actually a special forces guy in the Army during Vietnam. So he hated their tactics, hated their culture, and felt like they were kind of one of the least progressive services. And as he said to me, I would be putting stamps on envelopes. And so he really hated that idea. So, when you sign up for the military, you are signing away your civil liberties. And at the time, I wasn't ready to do that with both of my parents against that choice. So I ended up totally changing course and going into an investment banking program on Wall Street right after school.
So question.
Sure.
What made you that day or weeks before you wanted to get into the Army, what made you want that? Or did you see something that caught your eyes or somebody tell you about it?
Yeah, I think, my dad talked about being in Vietnam a lot, and he's actually a really artistic man. So he was an incredible, not only painter, but incredible photographer. And so when we were little, we had this unique view onto what the Special Forces life was like in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. And we would get these slideshows every once in a while from my father, where he would set up an old slide projector and show us the villages he lived in and the people they were training. And we would sometimes get stories from him. And I was just fascinated by the conflict. And I felt like I wanted to serve. And then my mom would pile on with all the stories of my grandpa in World War II. And every now and then I would get a chance to look in his chest and see his maps and things that he used, as they were crossing Germany. And it was just very intriguing to me. And I was very, very patriotic ever since I was a small child. Why? I can't really explain that to you.
Yeah.
But I felt a deep obligation towards what America stood for. And I really believe in kind of the underdog. And I feel like the American dream is, I know it's real because I've seen so much of it in our company. But that's something that just I was very passionate about. And so I felt like I wanted to serve the country.
That's amazing.
So when you decided not to do that and you went on to go do investment banking, how was that like being in New York and dealing with Wall Street? And I'm sure that that's another male-dominated, I would say, industry, probably especially at that time. What was your first day out on Wall Street like?
Yeah, so I would say the first 6 months were beyond exhilarating because, again, I came from a small town and all of a sudden I had these black cars picking me up to take me to work. I could order whatever I wanted from all these different menus and the food would be brought to us at night. And these were hard jobs to get.
Yeah.
So I had to compete hard to get one of these jobs at the time. And this was before the dot bomb. So Wall Street was going crazy. And it was all so alluring. And I just loved it at first until I realized that this was a place where I felt like at the time, the people I was associated with lacked complete character. And I did not realize that in the first 6 months, but I did realize it after the fact. And interestingly, there was a group, I won't name the bank, but there was a group that was recruited over to this bank because they were a top revenue producing group. And of course, the word went around the street that they needed analysts, and I was an analyst. And so I wanted to get into this particular group, and I kind of clandestinely interviewed for it, and I was accepted. And that's when things really took a downturn for me because this particular group was as kind of sharky as it gets. And I can remember to this day, one of the associates saying that he had also gone to Groton. And I thought, oh, well, okay, well, Groton. And he said that he was kicked out. And he was kicked out because he and his brother were accused of embezzling money out of the used bookstore. And at Groton, the used bookstore is there, to provide children who don't have as many financial means. And I thought, oh my God, like, I don't want to work with somebody like this. And I don't think that's cool. And then I can remember sitting there on Thanksgiving Day, or right there soon around that time. And the head of the group was actually dating a stripper from Scores. And I can remember he had this incredibly valuable art collection. And all of a sudden, this woman who I guess he had a spat with decided to cut the artwork out of the frames, thinking that she would pack it in a suitcase and sell it, not realizing that she would destroy the art. And so a bunch of us, not myself, a bunch of the boys were asked to go over to the apartment and prevent her from doing this. And that was kind of one of the last straws for me where I just thought, you know what?
Who am I hanging
I'm out.
with?
Yeah, I don't want to associate myself with
I'm going
people.
back to the tractor and haying the field. So it was not the right place for me. And I often tell people that the hardest experiences in my life are the most challenging. I would never take back, but my time on Wall Street, I would take back in a split second. I think I've certainly never worked as many hours in my life. But, I could justify it by saying, oh, I learned X, Y, or Z, but actually I think it just wasted my time. And so I deeply regret that. And it was the first time I had ever done something where I didn't follow my passions and where I was not deeply interested in what I was doing. So I would definitely say if you don't follow your passion, you'll end up in a situation that you don't want to be in. And so anyway, I left and I ended up in August of 2001 contracting with the United States Marine Corps. obviously didn't tell my parents, of course, because, I didn't
Yeah,
want
how
to.
did that go over?
Well, so of course, I contracted, and then, I didn't tell my parents, and then of course had no idea September 11th was coming. So still hadn't told them. And so that was just a much more difficult conversation, and they were very, very unhappy. And it was not a long conversation. They didn't hang up the phone because that's not how my parents are. But it was clear they were disgusted. And then they came around and really ended up supporting me at my commissioning, and were big proponents of my service. And but that was a tough phone call.
Tell us a little about being in the Marines and kind of what you can share about your first few months in it, and then kind of, was it what you expected, I guess, as well?
Yeah, I mean, the Marine Corps is, one of the best things I've ever done in my life, and around some of the best people. And, it lived up to my expectations and then some. It's an organization really about leadership. And it forces you to really consider who you are, and it forces you to really give of yourself for your team. So, I first started in officer candidate school, and it was very challenging for me. And I can remember thinking, if I can't make it through, I'm not doing this again. It's just too much mentally and physically. And eventually everybody gets injured. It's just a matter of whether you wear something out on your body before graduation or not. So we started, we only had one female platoon. So officer candidate school is separated between men and women. The basic school, which is the infantry course, is not. It's fully integrated. But in OCS, it's separated. And so our platoon was well over 50, and we ended up graduating 14. Now, some of these women were incredible, but again, it's just very physical. And then the male platoons also had an incredible dropout rate just because of physical injury. So I made it through to the end of that. And it was an incredibly rewarding experience to get, pinned with your Eagle, Globe, and Anchor and to actually become a Marine. So that's really one of my greatest honors in life. And then I went off to the basic school, and I think I do often tell a story where when I was in the service, women did not have the same freedoms and rights that they do now in the combat arms. And so I graduated in the top 10th percentile of my class. Wow. And that was actually a big challenge for me. And so in the Marine Corps, it's needs of the Corps unless you graduate in the top of your class, and then you get to pick your choice. But I was actually excluded from so many of the branches that I could go into that there were only very few choices. And the building that we lined up in to get our selection, you kind of lined up against the wall in rank order in your company. And a company has, give or take, about 250 Marines. And so I lined up along this wall towards the top. And when I got my selection, which ended up being aviation maintenance, it was like one of the only things I could choose, right? I mean, women couldn't do human, they couldn't do ground intel. I mean, you pretty much couldn't do anything.
What year was this?
This was in 2000. Well, I actually graduated in 2002. So I joined in 2001, but I graduated in 2002. We weren't actually given full rights, really, I think, until 2014. Oh, wow. So anyway, I'm walking back down this hallway past these 250 men. And I get to that last Marine, and I thought to myself, oh my God, like, he's last in the company and he could do anything he wants. And that was really the first time I felt discriminated against, which was particularly hard because I'm so patriotic. And I also felt like, gosh, I'm here. I'm willing to give my life for the country. And
you have to stand behind the last.
Yeah. So that was tough. But what made that experience great is the guys in my squad and my platoon, they wrote such great evaluations. So I realized at the time that their minds were bending. And some of them actually ended up being in very significant positions in the Marine Corps. And, I don't think they ever viewed women the same way because we had spent so much time together. So I knew their perspectives were changing. And, I was fuming mad for a couple days, and then I just picked my head up and went back on because, it's still a pioneer phase for women in a lot of segments. And so I think often if you want to draw people closer, the way to not do it is kind of spit on the things they care about. So, had I disrespected the Marine Corps hymn or the flag, I mean, that really wouldn't have gotten me anywhere, right? And so instead, I chose a different path to influence that outcome. So, but that was a memorable point for me, for sure, that day.
That's really great advice, though, because even in the industry that we're in now, and that's another reason why Macy and I wanted to start this podcast, was because we believe that you can't go anywhere if we're not all working together for the same goal, and you can't point fingers at anybody, because if once you single out and let's say you were to have done something disruptive, you just start to lose credibility, and if you just take the higher road like you did, you gain more respect, and in the end, they ended up complimenting you and even writing probably things about how great you were. And that was all because of the route you decided to take when you were faced with adversity. So I think that's really great.
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing is most humans recognize when something's unfair, right? And it doesn't mean it changes that moment, but I think it was a bigger point to them. And I think they felt like it was unfair, because it was. So, again, I think I've been through a lot of different situations like that, but none of them would I take back, and none of them do I regret. Because again, I think I was around people of character all the time. So what I was dealing with was legacies of either habit or tradition that various societies may have, and those take time to evolve.
Yeah, no, that's true. So when you finished with your time in the Marines, you were sent to Afghanistan, right?
Actually, I did all my tours overseas in Iraq. I actually never went outside of that theater, because my last tour, I ended up coming home in 2008, but I never left that country.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so when you came back home in 2008, what was life like that after?
That was a very challenging transition for me. I would say both times I came home. So when I first went overseas to Iraq, I was deployed, and I did a second deployment when I was over there. And so I came home and I actually went to Harvard Business School after my second deployment, but I was still on something we call terminal leave in the Marine Corps. So I really don't think I had enough distance between kind of, as we call it, getting off the boat and reintegrating into society. And so I was very resentful of my classmates. I was in a very righteous mode. And I also felt, I felt survivor's guilt, but I also really felt like a loser for leaving everybody in the fight and going to this, brick campus with Ivy and everybody talking about, which bar they were going to go to or which party. And so I purposely, isolated myself from the student body and just decided the only way I could make it right was to study as hard as possible. And so every day I tried to be as prepared as possible for my case studies. I spent a lot of time with my professors, but I was completely antisocial. And I was not a happy person. I was happy because I was learning, but I definitely wasn't integrated. And again, it wasn't that there was anything wrong with the students there. It was just too stark of a contrast to 1 minute, be walking around with a rifle and the next minute, have a case study in your hand.
So what made you go from the Army and then decide to go to Harvard
school?
So
I knew I didn't have a future in the Marine Corps. And I knew that because at the time, women could not be in command of a combatant force. And so if you are not in command of a combatant force, then you cannot begin to put stars on your collar eventually. Okay. And as you rise up, you're really pigeonholed. I was very lucky during the war because the war presented all kinds of opportunities and all different types of jobs. And so I ended up actually getting a fabulous experience that was incredibly challenging over there. But for the future of my career, I knew I was only going to serve a period of time. So I did not know what I wanted to do. So I applied to business school. I actually applied while I was over there. And one of the guys that I worked with, who at the time was like a little no-name major in the Iraqi army, his name is actually Major General Othman Ghanemi, and he's actually now the highest-ranking Iraqi army official in the country. But I can remember going to him and saying, through my translator, I need a recommendation for Harvard Business School. Because I had not looked at the timelines or anything. And he wrote me one, of course, in Arabic. And I just thought, well, what the heck, I'm not going to get into this school anyway.
Yeah.
So I submitted it. I still to this day don't know if they had somebody translate it or not.
And they got it.
But yeah, they got it. And I was with one of my dear Marines. He was a little lance corporal, and I remember we came into this one area where we had civilian unsecured internet connection, and I was like, I'll check this out, see if I got in. And I was like, oh my gosh, I got in. And
oh my gosh, that's amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And it was, I'll not forget that day, because I remember he was excited for me. But I remember he said to me, well, ma'am, you need to get out of here because your life's too valuable now.
Yeah.
And that really struck me, and it's affected me a lot ever since, because, people expect you to give back if you have certain paths or journeys. And so it's something I take really seriously. But yeah, that was a unique experience. And then eventually I was able to call my dad, and I think the first thing he said is, wow, I never thought you'd get in there. So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so that was kind of fun. But yeah, I wish I'd kept a copy or somehow got a copy
of the Arabic.
Yeah.
So 2 small questions. I feel like New York and the investment banking and all that, as well as Harvard, are things that I've seen growing up my whole life in movies.
Yeah.
Is it what the movies look like?
For me, Wall Street was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really was. But again, that was at a time, again, it was before the dot bomb. It was before a lot of kind of progression has been made and what a workplace should look like from an inclusion perspective. And it was more of what you read about on Wall Street with people throwing staplers across the room and things of that nature.
Like that movie Wolf on Wall Street.
Yeah, a little bit more like that, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was definitely my experience. And I'm sure, again, that was a lot of years ago, right? You're talking about 98, 99.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm sure extremely different now. But yeah, that one was for sure. And Harvard Business School is just, it's just such a beautiful campus, and it's a very privileged place with incredibly bright people. So I don't know what a movie of that place would look like, but you definitely you feel very or I felt very lucky like, oh my goodness, I would also say to everybody who's thinking about applying places is just apply, because you never know. My test scores are not good, and I think sometimes people shy away from looking at opportunities because they just think, well, I could never go there. And I would encourage you not to do that.
That's it speaks to me.
Yeah, for sure. Because I know I've always thought about getting my master's, and I'm like, well, I can't do the test. You always think of something, an excuse, right, to why you think you're not good enough. So that's really good advice, especially for everybody listening. So what year was that whenever you graduated Harvard?
So I graduated in 2007. I didn't actually get to graduate. I technically graduated, but what ended up happening is when I worked for, when I did my first tours overseas, I ended up working for General Petraeus. And at the time, he was a 3-star general. And when I was in my second year of business school is a 2-year program, the United States was considering pinning him with a 4th star and giving him overall command of that theater. And he had a Senate confirmation hearing to get that. And I ended up going out to see him and talk about Iraq and the situation there, and whether or not he believed that there was still a window open for us to win the war. And that was, I think, a week or so before that Senate confirmation hearing. And so we talked about it, and I said I would go back overseas. And I, of course, thought I was a civilian, but I really had no reason not to go back into service. I didn't have children at the time, and I didn't have a husband. So I got back on the plane, and I actually knew that time was going to be a really tough conversation with my parents. And not in the way that the other ones had been, but just because I knew they would be scared that kind of I'd run out of my 9 lives. So that was in February, and I told the school I would be returning, and General Petraeus needed us back quickly because we surged back overseas in May of 2007. And so the school was incredibly generous. The professors were so generous and worked with me to give me, to let me sit for my exams early. And then myself and a couple other Marines that formed a team called Team Phoenix, we went back through training and we redeployed overseas. So I did miss my graduation. And that's actually kind of how I ended up here in this spot, because I came home and I was off kind of the normal recruiting process. And during this time, which is kind of a piece I've left out, my parents had decided to retire, and they did not want to go to like a Florida retirement community. So they decided to make a journey west across the country and look for open land. And where I grew up had become very expensive, and all the cornfields had turned into houses. Oh, wow. So they ended up stopping in Texas, and in a little town called Washington, Texas. And they found this old ranch, an old ranch house. And when I heard they were retiring in Texas, I was like, what are you doing? Like, is it flat and dust balls are rolling by?
Super hot.
So I hadn't, physically been able to see them a lot since I had spent so much time in the Marine Corps. And I decided when I came home from my last tour, I really didn't care what I did. I just wanted to be with my mother and father. And they were here. And that is why I came here. And I spent a lot of time with them, just helping them with the cattle out there and the horses. And I had a good friend of mine who was in the Army, who was also at Harvard Business School, who was also at a firm called SCF Partners. And he was like, what are you doing? And I said, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have a plan.
I'm on a farm right now, and I like being on the farm.
I think he was concerned I was drifting.
Yeah.
So he said, well, why don't you come meet this man who founded our firm, and we can have breakfast. And so I went to breakfast, and I met Ellie Simmons, who founded SCF Partners, and he brought me back to his office. And I think, that was a time where people were really trying to figure out how they could help veterans. And Ellie, I think, took pity on me and, gave me a job at SCF.
I doubt they really took
pity.
No,
they
probably
did.
were
he
like,
did. He did.
This woman's amazing.
Hardly. And so he gave me a job, and I started to work on their portfolio companies, forecasting them. Except the problem is that I remember the CFO at the time, Anthony DeLuca, had asked me to put a cash flow statement together of all these portfolio companies. And of course, I went to Harvard Business School, which is general management. I had no clue what I was doing.
Yeah.
So I just told him, I'm sorry, I have no clue. So, I credit him with really teaching me the financial statements and how $1 of cash flows through those 3 statements. And so we sat in a dark room, actually, for well over a year, ripping apart the financial statements and piecing them back together, forecasting the portfolio. And it really wasn't until 2010 when we started thinking about building 9 that I started a more traditional PE role. And that was actually simultaneous with kind of finding a sense of purpose again in life, because leaving the Marine Corps is monumental, especially when you've left a combat zone and your friends, and some of whom didn't come back. And then I met Ricky Green and Rory Barbeau in December of 2010, and they were the first American entrepreneurs I had come in contact with. And I remember to this day seeing them because they were wearing these old rough hoodies. And they started from nothing, and they started on a dirt floor, and they built this incredibly successful completion tools business. And I just thought, these are my guys. These are the kind of people I want to be with. And these are the people who make the American dream real. And I love their character. And what you learn about good entrepreneurs is they're so loyal to their teams, and they always want to give back. And it felt to me like I could support the country again, because in support of them, I was supporting business and I was supporting the economy. And that's how I found my sense of purpose.
So you talk a lot about your differences when you came back and like when you left. And it sounds like through what you've said that maybe you struggled some.
Yeah, absolutely struggled.
And I know that when a lot of people come back from military, some of them, struggle for a very long time and never can find that purpose. So what do you think pulled you out of that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could tell you. I want to say it was them. And then the subsequent amazing teams I partnered with after that, because I was not the same person before, right? So I was a very, I wish I'd known the pieces that I would lose. I gained a lot of pieces, but you forever lose a certain piece of your joy or your view of humankind, I think, once you go into combat zone. And it's okay, but you kind of just wish you knew that was going to happen. And it just takes a while to reconcile that. And it takes a while to go, in previous wars and in previous decades, it took a long time to journey home, right? If you think all the way back even to the mythical book of Odysseus, right? That was a 7-year journey home.
Yeah.
And in those journeys home and in those boats in World War II, you had time to decompress outside of the combat zone with your fellow soldiers or Marines. And now you're home in an instant, standing in the middle of an airport. So I think that's part of it. But for me, again, I really credit those teams, a lot of whom are still with me today, to my recovery and my path back to happiness.
Yeah, the way that you describe that, I totally just saw it, because I could only imagine what you see over when you're in combat. And then, yeah, you're right. Immediately you can get on an airplane and be in a civilization over here where people just go about their day like there's nothing else going on.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm now, I used to resent that, right? And now I realize that that's one of the beauties of the country, right? Is that we're not in so much conflict that we can be worried about getting to the grocery store, and we can be worried about a long commute or what paint color our house is or whether we can buy the sofa we want. And I've realized that's actually a gift, right? You don't want to be worried about whether you're going to be separated from your children or you're going to lose a family member. Like no human should live with that level of violence or fear. And so I've embraced that and relaxed into that now. And I worry about as many superficial things as every other one of my fellow Americans. And I see that as a gift.
And when did you meet your husband throughout this time?
So I met my husband overseas.
Oh, really?
Yes. So again, never know what can happen. And so again, when I made the choice to go back overseas, it was like, it was easy, right? Because again, there's no kids, there's no, I wasn't sacrificing that.
Yeah.
So I met Philip in 2007, and he was a Green Beret in the Special Forces. And we ended up getting married, and we eloped really in 2009. And we often joke that we couldn't afford, a honeymoon and a wedding or the kind of honeymoon I wanted. So we just did it all in one. And actually we were going to go back there for our 10-year anniversary, and Irma unfortunately blew the whole place away.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, he is literally my Achilles heel. Like if anything happened to him, I would go into a little jello blob and be dysfunctional. Because people have often said, oh, well, how do you function through this, that, and the other? And you never seem affected by it. And it's like, well, no, there's things that will take me down. And I'm very conscious of those. And if my husband weren't to be by my side, that would be one of them.
Does your husband work in oil and gas?
No, he stays at home. He is a stay-at-home dad. He was 13 years in the military, medically retired, and does everything for the kids. And that's like a huge head adjustment in Houston, Texas, right?
Yeah,
this is the coolest story I've ever heard.
I don't know about that, but
this is like
I love this.
just come to bedtime at our house. You might not think it's that cool. But yeah, so he has just been amazing, because that's hard on a guy's ego. I mean, I often think the fact that he's been in such deep combat is what allows him to do this, right? Because he knows if he's in a room of men, he's pushed himself to the physical, mental
Yeah, if they want to
limit,
say
right?
anything, he can be like, excuse me?
So, but he's just this magical father on top of that. And in a bit of a way, it's, again, a gift. I mean, the guy did 6 tours over there. And I think he's embraced it as that. And he also had his own really difficult experiences with losing children over there, and Iraqi children getting in the way of warfare. So I think the fact that he gets to spend time with his own children is something he doesn't take for granted.
So when did you have your first child?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so this is one little time where I would say I'm often not a proponent of women leaning in. I know that's kind of the new concept.
Yeah.
I'm much more of a proponent of my dad's advice to me, which is pick your battles wisely.
Yes.
And I picked 2 notable battles in my career. And this one wasn't so much a battle as a stand. I'll call this one a stand. But I was pregnant with my son. It was 2012. And we were going to bring 9 together in a 4-way Delaware merger. And I wanted to lead that merger. I wanted that chief financial officer role. And I did not want anyone else to get it. And I love these guys. And so I made it very clear to the firm that I wanted that position. I didn't expect anyone else to have it, and I didn't want them to interview other people for it. But the problem is that we were starting that process with a special committee memo that went out on August 13th, and my son was born on August 7th. So it made for a very truncated process with my son.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad I leaned in and claimed my stake, because I do think that could have been in jeopardy, maybe not, but I went really hard for that. And I ended up formally becoming the CFO that February when we consummated the merger. And I moved out of the SCF building and moved in with the team on the operational side.
So you were pregnant during that time when you were telling him you wanted that role?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. So
Did you feel at that time, did you feel like they might have looked at you like, oh, she's going to be a changed person after this? Or
well, I think people worry naturally, right?
Yeah.
It could be a lot of time out. It is a big change in lifestyle. I don't think it's unnatural to worry about whether somebody's work is going to be affected. I think that's a perfectly normal worry. I think more often than not, people will find that it's not affected, and women are very good at figuring that out if that's what they want. Right. So, but I think that's where it comes from. And I also think men don't want to disrupt your opportunity to have that time with your child, to be a mom. So I don't think sometimes you'll bump into chauvinism or racism, but I think more often than not, again, it's habitual, or it's cultural, or it's tradition. And that's in flux right now, and it's changing. So I think it's more that during pregnancy. It is a fragile time, right? Because you actually, as a new mom, a first mom, you actually don't know. And when I had my son, I remember thinking, I probably could stay home because I miss this little kid so much. And I lived in a condo downtown, and I would run from SCF at lunch, down the blocks, run to get time with him because I missed him so much. And then all of a sudden, around that 6-month mark, that stopped, and I was relaxed into my role. And so I don't know if that's primal, where there's a primal instinct, but it just went away from me, and I was perfectly fine going to work and thrilled that I was. And then the second time I leaned in was with my second child. That was a lot harder on me. I had Elizabeth June 4th of 2015.
Okay.
We formally announced my CEO role on July 6th. But
you had perfect timing.
I know. With her was really tough because I actually did physically go back to work because the company was in crisis. We had an unexpected departure. Our CEO decided to leave, and I was not anticipating getting that role. That was nowhere in, as we'd say in the Marine Corps, my brain housing group. So that was a shock to my system. I doubted whether I could do it. I'm not an engineer. And I thought, oh my gosh, everybody's going to be looking at me thinking, what are you doing? And I had this baby coming. So, and we were in a financial crisis. So that one was really challenging. And that's where I really leaned on my husband really hard. And finally, he just got so sick of me talking about how I couldn't do it and it was too much that he was like, all right, fine, just go in and tell him you can't do it. I'm like, oh, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
So, and then, my team was just amazing. So, and I remember when we had this gap in the CEO, I remember one of my West Texas entrepreneurs, I remember we were talking about, well, who are we going to get? Who are we going to do? And he was like, well, Miss Ann, I think you should be our CEO. And
my
I thought,
gosh.
okay, that was awesome. Yeah.
That's
Love that
so
guy.
awesome.
Mhm.
And the support that you had is amazing. And for
my
people,
guys are just amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just so inspirational and energizing, and they're just so smart, and they have so much business acumen, and most of them weren't given not one hand up. No SAT prep. I mean, if they had even an ounce of what a lot of the kids that I met at Harvard Business School had, they would just wallop them.
Wow.
And they're just incredible businessmen, right? And they judge people on competency and proficiency and hard work.
Yeah. That's
So-
that speaks volumes though of the people that you surround yourself with. And I think that's what makes somebody successful is it's not just them. It's also those that help you and those that mentor you.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, and Macy and I have talked about this before about having mentorship, and on some of the other people that have been on the podcast, they talked about how that's like a huge part of your growth and your potential is by being influenced by those that can actually help you succeed.
Oh, hugely. I mean, my team, I'm the CEO, so technically in an org chart, I sit in a box above them, but throughout this whole process and journey building 9, I mean, they have absolutely been mentoring me, supporting me, and, they've been amazing.
So what's a day in the life now as a CEO versus,
Oh my gosh.
Marine and there's just so much that you've done.
Oh, well.
I know you've experienced a lot.
Yeah, it's, we're still getting used to the public market. So I would say that, we IPO'd the company on the New York Stock Exchange in January of 18. We had, we almost lost the company in 15 and 16. So, and in fact, we had a going concern clause in our audit in 2017. So when we did the IPO, I was like, oh my God, how are we going to explain that like we want to do an IPO and use the funding for good purposes? Mm-hmm. And we've got this big old going concern clause, which is kind of like having a gun to your head. So we'd been through a lot as a company. So I think when we did the IPO and when the entrepreneurs and I stood on that bell ringing platform, for us, it was really about making it to the other side of that ditch. And it wasn't about, enriching ourselves or, buying a plane. It was preserving the ability for our team to still continue to have socioeconomic movement and progression in their careers. So my point there is that ever since I've been in a leadership role, it's been kind of one big downturn with the exception of 2018, which was very challenging because it was a market uptick off of being dead. Mm-hmm. And so, you don't have any inventory on the shelf. You don't have excess people. Mm-hmm. You don't have equipment ready that you need to get ready. I mean, so it was literally like turning something on as fast as we possibly could and asking a team that had been sprinting for a few years to continue sprinting. Mm-hmm. So that was really challenging. But, a day in the life of a CEO is very varied. It can be dealing with customers. It can be dealing with employee issues. Now that we're public, it's a lot of dealing with investors as well, telling your story, telling your strategy. What are the moats around your business? What are your barriers to entry? Where are your numbers? Why are your numbers there? Where are you going in the next 3 to 5 years?
It's
right?
very
Yeah,
stressful.
very. Yeah.
So, it's just learning to be who you are. And if they want to invest in you, they will. And if they don't, they won't. So, last year we were one of the top 3 performers from a stock perspective in the sector. This year we'll be one of the bottom 3 performers. It's a huge roller coaster. And I think, at first you have a grade out there on you in that stock all the time. So as the stock unwinds, you've got your public face there and, it can be humiliating. And it's probably a really good thing to experience. And so we've all experienced that. And then we kind of realized, okay, a lot of market forces here. We have a great team and we're getting to the other side again, just like we did last time. So, but it's a lot of picking yourself up and picking your team up and focusing on the strategy of the company, making sure people are focused on that and executing it. and building the bench. So we've been focused a lot on building talent within Nine. We've invested hugely in leadership development. So we started doing that in 2015, right in the middle of the downturn. And we brought in this incredible Navy SEAL who leads our program, and he builds our culture every day.
That's great. I've always loved the leadership part of, like, even at C&J, they provide classes, and I love that. And I got that first when I started at Schlumberger, and that was my favorite thing about Schlumberger was all of the courses and then they even would teach you sales, and they would videotape you, and then you'd get to see how you interact, and it was just a great experience. So that's really awesome that y'all are doing that.
Oh yeah, investing in people is always the best place to put your capital. And so we believe in that heavily. It's the last thing that gets touched from a spend perspective. The other thing is we believe in promoting and pulling up from within. So a lot of our guys don't have degrees that are post high school, and so we pack in those skill sets, and they're incredible leaders, and they have all that natural grit and tenacity. All that natural IQ and aptitude. And so it's just a matter of continuing to push them in the right direction. And so we have so many examples that are just really awe-inspiring, where people started at one level and they're responsible for huge pieces of our P&L, and a huge amount of people, and they're doing an absolutely fabulous job.
I feel like, too, when you come from that background, you almost care more because you work so hard to get where you're at. And I feel like, and I can see this a lot on my side, because I talk with people all day long as being in sales. It's my job. And I can tell, like, the differences between people who feel entitled to where they're at, and then for those that actually are appreciative of what they're doing. And it definitely sticks out. And I do think there is a difference there. And I don't think it should matter if you have a degree or not anymore, especially in our business where so many people learn so much in the field.
Yep.
And that knowledge you can always teach somebody about a P&L, but you can't teach somebody how to care.
I know.
I think that, and that's the same thing when you're trying to find salespeople, or, you can't teach somebody to have that relation, that connection, or be able to read a room. And, but you can teach people, like, math and the small things like
absolutely.
that. But personality is personality. And that is really what drives a company. And it sounds like you've surrounded yourself with the people that you relate to and that all have that same drive. So, I mean, there's no way you're not going to be successful with that.
One of my most special favorites, he is actually was a Canadian and is an Indian, actually, and we love that too because we have a lot of diversity. But he's like, yeah, we're all scrappers at Nine. We're all scrappers. I'm like, yep, that's what we are. We're scrappers.
Nice. So has it been challenging, just because looking at most of the wireline CEOs, let's say in North America, a lot of them came from an oil field background. They worked, 10, 15, 20 years in service companies. And it's really awesome, your story, especially not having that oil field background, not even in wireline, coil tubing, completions, which is really cool because it really shows you that you could be anybody you want in life as long as you have the drive behind it, the right people, and
it's all the team. I could not do what I do if I did not have my chief operating officer, and he knows the field in and out. But you do reach a point in leadership, and he would probably tell you the same thing, where you'll never be the technical expert of everything, right? So even if you think about kind of CEOs of large cap corporations, they're not technical experts in all of the various pieces and parts they lead.
The business.
Absolutely. And so it really becomes more about leadership and management. And obviously you need to understand your industry. You need to understand how you make money and how you create value for the customer. But you come up to a certain point where you will never technically outpace, and you should not be outpacing the people underneath you, right? The goal is to surround yourself with people who are brighter, better, smarter.
That's awesome.
And you should spend 90% of your time picking that team, because that team really defines the success or not. And so again, I have my right hand that runs this company every single day, and I wouldn't be sitting in this chair without him.
It sounds like you've been through a lot of stressful situations too. And how do you deal with the stress now, having the family? At least you have your husband who gets to take care of the kids, which is wonderful. So that kind of takes a little bit off.
Right.
But how do you deal, like, what is your outlet?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So when you're really busy and things are really chaotic, it's actually hard to find time for an outlet. And I would say the first manner in which I deal with stress is to reduce the time frame into small pieces. So whether that's in a combat zone or in a downturn, is don't kind of get up on the bow too often and look out at the horizon. Just get through that next month. And if a month becomes too much or too dark, then you do 2 weeks. And if that's too dark, then it's a week. And if that's too dark, it's a day. So I find that reducing your perspective in chaotic times is helpful. Is just where you need to go. And I say that because, in August of 2007, I found myself in a very difficult situation in Iraq where, we had so much terrain to take back, and we were living in a, frankly, a little hellhole in the middle of really an occupied area. And if you thought about it too much, you just thought, we're never getting out of here and we're never going to take this train back. So we had to think about it house by house. And so sometimes that's what I do, is I just go back down to little small increments. And then the other thing I do is, when I can and I have time, which I try to as much as possible, is I go out to see my parents, my family. And I make almost no obligations for the weekend. That's a general statement, but I try not to. And I walk around in a t-shirt and shorts and boots or my flip-flops. And I'm just at peace and in privacy with my family and the animals. And that's actually all I need to sustain me. So that's my outlet, and that's kind of how I deal with stress. Is just little pieces.
I love that. And I can say that when I've sometimes, especially when we go through these downturns, I can think the same thing. Like, I'll think so much at once about, like, everything that's going on and how I'm going to cover all of it.
Yep.
And I start to get hot and sweating, and I'm like, okay, wait, just break it down. There's just one thing. And I mean, I've never been in a very stressful situation like combat, but that's great advice. Like, I totally think that can help so many people to just break it apart and then just go day by day.
It's day by day, sometimes hour by hour.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with, obviously, oil and gas is a male-dominated industry. I'm assuming most of your big meetings, you're usually probably the only woman in the room. Do you feel like sometimes people have judged you, or kind of like, has it been harder for you to, I don't know how to explain it. Maybe we should cut this.
No, it's I know what you're getting after. It is different to be a woman. Again, I've been with this particular team since the start of the business. So we have been a team building the business together. I am not coming into this team, right? So we've all put our hands into this and worked very hard to build it. So I do think that's a unique factor for me. And I think, where it's a little bit tougher for women is when you get up to the level where you're dealing with boards or strategic decisions. Some of that might be gender and some of that might be age, right? Because there is this wisdom that comes with age. And so sometimes you get properly so and sometimes not properly so knocked for youth. So I do think there's still very much barriers for women. We can see it in the statistics as it relates to pay and promotion. Those are all still very real factors for women in the business world. The area I worry most about is more on the vocational side for women. So if you're in a position where you're in the field and let's say you're a great cement supervisor and you want to have kids, it's like, do you have the discretionary income to have those kids cared for so that you can do shift work? And that is a very real structural challenge in the country. And it is probably the one time I would say it needs some government support. So there's barriers, physical and otherwise, that are still really challenging for women in the workplace. But I think the judgments that are made or the critiques that are made can be debunked through performance and hard work and how you carry yourself. So you do need to be incredibly careful about how you carry yourself and not use your femininity in the wrong way because, that's a fast way to get disrespected.
Yep. That's
very well said. Yeah.
Yeah, very well said. And another reason why we wanted to start this podcast was for that reason. It's in itself is Macy and I we're not feminists, and we do believe that women should be created equal, but we feel like everybody should be created equal. And sometimes there's two roles that maybe a woman and a man might be up against, and maybe the man is more qualified, and that's just and that's equal. I mean, he's more qualified. So there shouldn't, we just don't believe and reaching quotas where you have to hire that woman because
quotas I don't agree with. I do think there's still subconscious bias where unfortunately there are women that will say, oh well, he was selected because he was a man, and you might actually look at the credentials and say, no, he was selected because he's better than you are. But there's also other cases where that's not the case. But I think quotas are an awful, awful thing, and they just by nature will lead to the wrong outcome, and they create resentment. And, really what I believe in is just holding the same standards, and then, trying to work on that habit, tradition, and breaking down those subconscious biases that exist in society.
That's a perfect answer to that. There's nothing I can really add.
It's, I guess, just to finish off, because we've had such a great story so far, is what advice would you give to any young woman coming into the industry who is scared or worried because it is a male dominated? But I think with your story, we're showing the world that, a woman like yourself from the small town who went through a lot of challenges is now CEO of a service company, which is a huge accomplishment.
Thank you.
Thank you. So what kind of advice would you give your daughter, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the number one piece of advice is please just be yourself, right? So if you want to paint your nails and put makeup on, do it. If you don't want to hunt, don't do it. I don't like hunting animals. I don't like that. So I don't go hunt with my guys. And they know I don't like it, right? I have to admit this, but I don't like barbecue either. So I'm not going to go eat a bunch of barbecue. So I would say just be yourself and let the team let you contribute where you contribute and where your strengths are. Everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. You're not strong in all categories. Just contribute those where they come naturally. And, be very kind, I would say, and be very respectful of others, and be very willing to give of yourself to your team if you're in a leadership role, or you shouldn't be in one. So, but definitely just be who you are.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And just to spin off that really quick, I can say that I've only been in the industry for 7 years. But one thing I've done from the very beginning, no matter who I was talking to, I was always me. And no matter what company I moved to, I was always myself. And because of that reason, I've been able to build lasting relationships with customers and been able to bring them no matter where I go. And I never have to think twice about it because I'm always just being Jamie.
Yeah.
And I feel like the advice that you just gave is 100% true no matter what industry you're in. And you're more comfortable as yourself if you just don't let anybody stand in the way of who you are. And if there's things that you don't like, then just don't do them. It's not that big of a deal.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's great advice. So I'm just so glad we got you on here today.
Well, thank you guys.
So
this was so much fun.
This
is great. Good luck to you both.
Thank
you.